going to go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone, to the Stimson Center. I am Samir Lalwani. I am the Senior Fellow for Asia Strategy here at the Stimson Center, along with the Co-Director for South Asia. I'm here to just introduce today's event and then turn it over to the eminent panel we have before us. And today's event is The Nuclear Future, Can There Be Order Without Trust? I'm here because my colleague, Michael Crapon, who helped conceptualize this along with my colleague Hannah Hagelin. Michael unfortunately couldn't be here today, so I'm his fill-in. And I'll confess up front that I am not an expert in the global nuclear order. But that's, the lack of expertise has never really stopped anyone in Washington from talking incessantly, so I will proceed with the same. But let me just try to situate for you this discussion, tell you why I think it's important. The current presidency, the Trump presidency, has triggered a lot of debates about the liberal international order between critics and defenders of the president and whether his approach to international politics is strengthening or jeopardizing the liberal international order. But I think there's a second vigorous debate that has also occurred, principally amongst academics and think tankers, and that is as to whether the liberal international order even existed and whether the conceit of it is worth maintaining or resurrecting. I think you've seen some writing on this, for example, from Rebecca Lissner and Mira Rapp-Hooper in the Washington Quarterly on where we go post the Trump presidency with regards to this order. But also recently, actually yesterday, there was an article in the Lawfare blog by Paul Stanlin raising this question of, what was a liberal international order really? And Graham Allison has an essay in Foreign Affairs, this current issue, that basically describes the international order as conceptual jello. So it is an important discussion that is, I think, producing a lot of debate. And there's empirical questions that have been raised as to whether this order, consisting of international institutions, rules, norms, and free trade, was in fact broadly accepted, evenly distributed, and deeply impactful on states' foreign policy behavior or not. In other words, did the predictions of regime theory play out? Did it really create joint liability, reduce transaction costs, and sufficient information to reduce uncertainty? So one account suggests that despite this conventional wisdom, the liberal international order's impact was quite narrow, benefited only a few, and was far more shallow in most parts of the world, and that it was advanced by coercion and or violence. So it's important to extend this discussion and with the same level of scrutiny to the non-proliferation and arms control community, which oftentimes can be quite insulated or unanchored from sort of these broader geopolitical debates. So in some parts of the arms control non-proliferation community, I think there's a belief that non-proliferation is a public good, that it's not a product of coercion to advance great power self-interest, and yet there are a lot of outsiders outside the order, for instance, in a world that I deal with in South Asia, that raise questions about that assumption. Nevertheless, there's lots of good research to suggest that the non-proliferation regime and current nuclear order were developed and maintained by a great deal of coercion, both to adversaries and allies, and sometimes with kinetic force, alongside a great deal of hypocrisy and risk. So in such an environment where the order is being challenged and in its initial utility and value is being questioned, it's important to raise some questions and start with one we have before us today. Can there be order without trust? And so with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Hannah Hagelin, who has been doing a lot of thinking and writing on the subject, including an essay published today by the Stimson Center, and she'll be the host for this session today.
All right, thank you, Samir. And let me reiterate his thanks to all of you for joining us here, including those of you that are on the live stream. As Samir said, this is really set up to be a discussion of trust and maybe the lack of it in today's global nuclear order. I'm Hannah Hagelin, analyst here in the South Asia program. And the series that Samir mentioned is one that's been conceived by our co-founder, Michael Crapon, to really try and think about where do we go from here as we situate ourselves in the current political climate and the state of today's global nuclear order. How can we move forward? And so we brought together some pretty impressive scholars who are thinking about new ideas about the path forward. Some of the old ways of dealing with nuclear weapons have continued relevance, I would say, but others may not. And so we would argue that new ideas are merited. Developments in relations between major powers and nuclear armed states in tense regions around the world have really rendered the future of arms control and nuclear confidence building, and perhaps also the US role as a leader in that, uncertain. And so today, while most of my colleagues I think will probably focus on Europe, I would offer one thought on Asia's role in this conversation. A nuclearized Asia has really presented for us both new challenges and opportunities. And these challenges are multipolar in their nature. In this second nuclear age, the challenges we face really require multilateral solutions. Multilateral confidence-building measures that fail to include nuclear-armed states outside of the NPT, like India and Pakistan, fall short of their potential to have a meaningful global impact. And I would suggest to you that effective efforts to tackle the very uncertain future of arms control and nuclear security challenges require NPT states to really consider how to involve non-NPT states in the conversation. And finally, the uncertainty about the United States' role in this process moving forward may indicate that there is space and perhaps also a need for other nuclear-armed states to carve out a path towards a stronger global nuclear order. Previous speakers in this series have included Ambassador Lou Dunn and Professor Scott Sagan, and today we're joined by these four impressive scholars whose work focuses on new and revised approaches to arms control in the global nuclear order. So today we're going to get started with a set of remarks from Dr. Heather Williams to my left. Heather is a lecturer in defense studies at King's College London. She is also an adjunct research staff member in the Strategy, Forces, and Resource Division of the Institute for Defense Analyses, which is in Alexandria, Virginia, and she has worked there since 2008. Until January 2015, Heather was a research fellow on nuclear weapons policy at Chatham House and led projects on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as well as the Humanitarian Impacts of Nuclear Weapons Initiative. So Heather's going to offer us some thoughts related to her recent work on trust in U.S.-Russia arms control negotiations. And then after that, I'll ask each of our panelists to respond and talk about some of their own work in relation to that, and then we'll open this up for a broader Q&A discussion. Excellent.
Right. Hello. First, I want to start really by thanking Hannah and Samir and also Michael, even though he's not here, for the opportunity. I was really honored to be invited to talk at Stimson. What I wanted to do with this really great opportunity is to actually offer you something a bit different and talk about perspectives that you might not often hear in the Washington community. And mainly I want to provide perspective from those who think that, we're talking about distrust and the global nuclear order. I want to offer the perspective of those who think that the U.S. is responsible for distrust and the breakdown of the global nuclear order. And I should just say, caveating all of that up front, I'm not saying I agree with these positions. Some of them I think are highly problematic. But talking about trust building, a really important component of that is empathy and trying to see where the other side comes from. So that's my impetus behind what I'll cover today. What I'll start with is I'll talk about why trust matters and some definitions. I promise not to be too academic-y. If I wander that way, then somebody throw your hand up and tell me. But then I'm going to focus on three specific trust challenges. The first being U.S.-Russia arms control. And for that, I'll offer some insights into the Russian perspective about the breakdown of arms control. Second, I'll talk about waning U.S. credibility among European allies and talk about the allies' perspective. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the cornerstone of the global nuclear order, the NPT. And with that, I'll focus on recent research that I've been doing into the nuclear ban treaty and try to tell you a little bit about what's their perspective on trust within the NPT itself. But I'll also give you my bottom line up front. Talking to allies, adversaries, partners alike, the general consensus is that the United States is withdrawing from its leadership role in the global nuclear order. And it's no longer interested in active engagement. The NPR was popular with some crowds, not with all. And so that perspective is pretty pervasive, particularly across Europe where I'm based. And so some things that I think the US can think about going forward is how to engage more actively with partners, adversaries, and allies, specifically identifying concrete opportunities for partnership and cooperation. Because the real challenge here is, how do you lead when your leadership doesn't carry the same credibility that it once did? You need partners, you need allies. So there's my bottom line in case anyone has to run out or, I get really boring. But then a quick follow-on point to that is a challenge that I see is that with trust building, it's not just about empathy. It's not just about leadership. It's also about having domestic political will and interest in global nuclear issues. And looking out, and I'm seeing Alex Bell, who's doing a lot of work on these issues, and that we need to think more about how to build domestic interest in nuclear issues. So first, why does trust matter? Again, I promise this is the only academic part of the talk. When we talk about trust, my definition is that trust is the expectation of favorable behavior in a mutually vulnerable and reciprocal relationship. Two most important words in there, vulnerability and reciprocal. You are accepting risk, you're accepting vulnerability, but you're doing it in exchange for something. You think that you're going to get a net gain out of this. But also with regards to trust, we always need to ask, trust to do what? So to use an example, under New START, we trust Russia to abide by the rules as outlined in the treaty. Do we trust them in other areas of US-Russia relations? No. But for that specific treaty, we do trust them, and we do conduct on-site inspections. We do accept some limitations on our own forces. With regards to allies, we trust them to coordinate with the US and not to undertake actions that undermine US national security interests. And in the NPT, we trust states parties to observe the three pillars: progress towards disarmament, non-proliferation, and peaceful uses. So trust is about this acceptance of risk and vulnerability. But ultimately, states will trust when it's in the national interest. It's not a gift that you give. You get something in return. But I also will acknowledge up front, a lot of people are skeptical about this approach to trust and say, no, there is no trust in all of this. And what they point to is trust but verify, and say, is trust but verify a contradiction? If you really trusted a partner, you trusted somebody, you wouldn't need to verify. An example that a lot of people point to would be in a marriage. If you really trust your husband or wife, you're probably not going to check their text messages. It's the idea. To that, I would just argue that, well, states aren't partners. The US-Russia arms control relationship, hardly a marriage. But also, in arms control in particular, what you are doing, verification also comes with vulnerability. Think about it, on-site inspections, you're opening up your most prized assets to a foreign potential adversary. These are things you don't show to even your whole government. There is a vulnerability component to this. No verification is 100%, and trust is unavoidable. How do we build trust? Nick Wheeler, University of Birmingham, has a great new book out on this called Trusting Enemies. And in his previous work with Ken Booth, they argue that trust building is a matter about empathy, that if you can see another side's version of events. So as I said, I'll start off by trying to offer those different perspectives, but I also want to flag that trust requires domestic political leadership. And in my closing remarks, I'll offer some ideas for what we can do with that. So turning to the first trust challenge, which is the breakdown in US-Russia arms control. As we know, both the US and Russia accuse each other of violating the 1987 INF Treaty. New START is due to expire in 2021 unless it's extended for 5 years. But there are no prospects for a follow-on agreement, which would further reduce arsenals, and no prospects for incorporating emerging technologies, which could be potentially destabilizing. So what's the Russian perspective on this? I'm guessing the US perspective is pretty familiar to most people in the room. What are some of the Russians saying on this? For Moscow, the US has persistently violated its arms control agreements. It withdrew from the ABM Treaty, it's failed to ratify CTBT, and expanded NATO up to Russian borders. Also, many Russians point out that well before the 2014 State Department report about Russia's alleged violations of INF, that well before that, Russia raised their own concerns about US violations of INF. But these went ignored. So Russia's issues with the treaty were ignored, but the US wants theirs to be really important, or wants theirs to take center stage. Drawing on one example of Russia's allegations of US noncompliance with INF, is this argument that the Mark 41 interceptor could be substituted for a cruise missile. You struggle to engage with it. I did at least. And I talked to quite a few Russians, and one of them actually explained this to me in a way that I could kind of get on board with. And their argument was, you can open up the missile defense tube and show there is no cruise missile in there. So you could have verification of this. But the Russian perspective was, what about in a crisis? How do we know that you aren't going to put a cruise missile in there in a crisis? We don't trust you for that. And so it's that crisis dynamic that I think is actually quite interesting, and you can somewhat see their perspective. There are some very major technical problems with this concern of the Russians. However, that's at least their perspective. Another point that I often hear is that America is more interested in superiority than stability. And in any future agreement, the US isn't going to offer up anything substantive, particularly limits on missile defense or conventional weapons. Looking to broader geopolitics, here in the US, we often criticize Russia for their use of information operations and so-called hybrid warfare. But Russia actually would say that, well, the US were the ones who started hybrid warfare. And really, I think everything that we accuse Russia of doing, they equally accuse the US of doing to them. So just to reiterate, I'm not agreeing with these. I just want to offer the other perspective here. If we don't resolve these issues of mutual distrust, that comes with risks. This would be the main risk would be the absence of a renewed commitment to arms control. We would face a post-arms control era without the transparency and predictability that we have enjoyed under agreements such as New START, although they may be imperfect. This would mean we don't have practical benefits, such as insights into Russia's missile development programs, but we would also lack the broader political benefits and trust and confidence building measures. And finally, we would lack channels of communication and institutions for risk reduction. So that's the first trust challenge, and hopefully a taste of the Russian perspective. Turning to the second trust challenge, which is the US and its allies. Probably no surprise to anyone in this room, but allies are questioning America's commitment to their security. This includes some of Trump's statements about NATO burden sharing, but it does go back beyond the current administration. One recent example was Ulrich Kuhn yesterday posted on Twitter, if anyone wants to look it up, about a recent story in Germany about should Germany get the bomb. And this isn't totally new. There were discussions about this a year or two ago as well. But then also questions about whether or not there should be a Euro deterrent potentially provided by the French. In terms of strengthening US credibility and deterrence within NATO, the Brussels communique sent a really strong message of a coherent deterrence messaging and commitment, but there are some deep underlying concerns about whether or not America remains a credible partner. And so the European perspective, 29 members of NATO, 29 different perspectives at least, probably more. Coordinating among these is really challenging. And so what might assure Estonia might make Germany feel less assured. That's a real challenge. This is a classic abandonment entrapment paradox. Again, it's not totally new, but what is new is that Russian aggression and some of Trump's statements about burden sharing are poking at that and exacerbating it, as is the ban treaty, which I'll talk about in a little bit. This is particularly challenging for countries that have anti-nuclear sentiments and that are being pressured by groups such as ICANN, and this would include Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, and Belgium. And for politicians in these countries, there's simply nothing to be gained by coming out and being pro-US, or being pro-nuclear weapons, or speaking out in favor of a stronger deterrent. As someone from one of these countries described it to me, politicians in this group of countries, they stand nothing to gain by supporting nuclear weapons, but they might actually gain some votes by coming out against nuclear weapons. So there's domestic political factors here as well. But also there is an increasingly strong anti-US sentiment in Europe. And however bad you think it is, it's worse. I'm sorry to tell you. So there are, as I said, there are just these questions about America's credibility, but it's intersecting with these domestic factors. And I think some Europeans are asking themselves, is a nuclear NATO really worth it? The risks to this, really, it's an issue of NATO cohesion. And this comes at a time when you see Russia specifically trying to break NATO unity. And Russia might see this as an opportunity for making some strategic gains. Also, in a more extreme scenario, you could see further proliferation in Europe, though I do think this is a little bit hyped. But more broadly, this, if there is a breakdown or distrust within NATO, within the US's commitment to Europe, That is a fundamental shift in not just the global nuclear order, but in the global order as we know it. So there are much bigger risks at play here. And then turning to the final trust challenge, this is the NPT. And of all the challenges I'm talking about, I actually think this is the hardest. The NPT faces difficult questions about its legitimacy and efficacy. Specific issues include whether or not there can be a WMD-free zone in the Middle East, whether or not the NPT is the place to discuss the use of WMD, all WMD, and this came up at the recent PrepCom, but also the ban treaty. I'm going to talk about the ban treaty, but I want to emphasize it's not just about the ban treaty. The NPT has much bigger and more historic issues that have been going on. The nuclear ban treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, now has 13 members as of Friday, I believe. It's a symptom rather than the sole cause of distrust within the NPT, and it's distrust on both sides. I want to say that at the outset. For the nuclear weapon states, there is this feeling that the ban supporters didn't act in good faith. They weren't upfront about their intentions. But obviously, the supporters of the ban also feel a bit of distrust. And for their perspective, the ban treaty results from frustration with a lack of progress towards disarmament. And to anticipate a counter-argument, they would argue that the 88-89% cuts in the US arsenal since the height of the Cold War, their argument is, well, those cuts were only made because it was convenient. It didn't reflect a genuine commitment to nuclear disarmament. At the most recent PrepCom, the US rolled out a new kind of approach to disarmament issues, the conditions-based approach, which is really trying to be an opportunity for other states to engage and come up with new disarmament initiatives. And to some extent, that was well received. But for the majority of states that I talked to at least, and that includes allies, they're really tired of listing out to the US what they want in disarmament. I've asked them quite a few times, what would you want to see? And their response is, we've told you over and over again. We want a CTBT, we want an FMCT, we want unilateral reductions, we want de-alerting. Okay, what else do you want? And they're really tired of the US constantly coming to them and asking them that. What they want is action. And this is the underlying motive for the ban treaty. The ban treaty is not about the elimination of nuclear weapons. The ban treaty is about changing the way we talk about nuclear weapons, and to some extent, they've been successful in that. There are risks to the NPT that are associated with the ban treaty. I know there are some states that are talking about questioning the 1995 indefinite extension of the NPT, and 2020 is the 25th anniversary. I think the bigger risk is gradual stagnation, and the NPT turning into a shell of a forum of a discussion forum. It would look a little bit more like the Conference on Disarmament. You just see waning legitimacy of the NPT as an institution. I don't think this will lead to some proliferation cascade, but it will reduce forums for discussion of nuclear and other WMD issues, and it will reduce opportunities for cooperation and reducing nuclear risks. So hopefully you can see all of these trust challenges, there is some overlap amongst all of them as well. So I tell them discreetly, but they aren't quite that discreet. And then for my kind of final few minutes, I wanted to offer some ideas for the way forward and how to address these trust challenges. First, with arms control. In the short term, there just really aren't many options. They're extremely limited. So what I think we can do is think to a more long-term arms control agenda and start laying the groundwork for that now and start crafting tools and relationships that we can consider employing when conditions change. For the short term, arms control efforts can focus on risk reduction, crisis communication with Russia, and keeping open the few remaining lines of communication. Ideas could include extending the New START Treaty, which would seem like a low-hanging fruit, discussion of risks within the P5 process, and expanding on Track 1.5s and Track 2s, particularly with next-generation Russian experts that really do need to be fostered and encouraged. For the long-term options, as I've argued elsewhere, I think arms control needs to move towards a cross-domain nature, what I call asymmetric arms control, which I'm happy to go into more during the Q&A. But I think the future of arms control will probably look very different than arms control as we know it now. For rebuilding trust with allies, This will require the U.S. to engage bilaterally, but also to show that they understand the unique domestic challenges that these allies face. And that can be as simple as saying, tell us about your public attitudes around nuclear issues. ICANN recently commissioned a poll in some European states about their attitudes to nuclear issues. Well, it was commissioned by ICANN. You can imagine that the responses were overwhelmingly in favor of joining the ban treaty. And despite how these questions were framed, I was not particularly surprised by them. So there is a genuine public concern and public pressure going on in these countries that I think the U.S. can engage with. Another challenge for the U.S., though, is consistent messaging across the whole of government, but then also having high visibility of American senior leadership, particularly Secretary Mattis, who is extremely popular and carries a lot of credibility within Europe. And then finally, with the NPT agenda, what is to be done? As I said, I think this might be one of the most challenging of these issues. Some specific ideas are encouraging U.S. allies and partners to play more of a leadership role in the NPT, such as Sweden and the Netherlands. We saw this at the most recent PrepCom, but also building new initiatives around risk reduction, nuclear education, discussion of nuclear ethics, and humanitarian consequences. The ban treaty doesn't get a monopoly in talking about humanitarian consequences or ethics. We can also engage in these discussions. But one of my biggest concerns that came out of research quite recently was, I thought going into 2020 review conference, I thought that at least you could get all states parties to reaffirm their commitment to the NPT. I don't think you can get that. Because what a lot of members are going to want is they're going to say, we don't just want to reaffirm commitment to the NPT, we want it to be the NPT plus all subsequent agreements. So it would have to also include the 2013 steps and the 2010 action plan. That is a deep concern that I have about the credibility of the NPT itself when you can't get all states parties to sign on board. So to answer the question of this panel, can there be order without trust? Yeah. I think it's much too soon to predict a collapse of the global nuclear order. We aren't living in nuclear anarchy. There hasn't been the extensive proliferation that was feared by President Kennedy. We still have forums for dialogue, and we still have institutions that can promote transparency and predictability. These are increasingly fragile, and I just encourage the U.S. to engage more on these issues, but I don't want to be too alarmist. And then this, I promise, is my final point. I focused here on sources of distrust outside the U.S., but I'm going to end with a paradox for the United States. So states are calling on the U.S. to play more of a leadership role. This would include engaging with Russia and reducing the salience of nuclear weapons. However, whenever the U.S. does engage or offers a new nuclear agenda, such as the conditions-based approach, it's criticized. And it's told, this is too shallow, this isn't enough. And states don't trust American intentions behind the policy. So that's what I mean whereby, to some extent, to use the expression, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And that's something I'd be really interested to hear feedback on from anyone in this room, is how the U.S. can engage and can play a leadership role in working with allies, but without drawing that criticism that historically has been part of the debate. And so with that, I'll stop and look forward to questions.
We can
Yeah.
Thank you, Heather. It was tremendously rich, and I think refreshingly different from what we usually hear in DC. We're going to turn now to our panelists. So I'll run through their bios quickly, and then they're each going to offer maybe 8 to 10 minutes of responses, and then we'll ask all of you to join us in the conversation. So first up, we have Dr. Justin Anderson to my right. Justin is a senior fellow at the National Defense University Center for the Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction. His research focuses on deterrence, both nuclear and non-nuclear, nuclear forces, and future nuclear arms control agreements and confidence-building measures. Prior to joining the center, he was a senior policy analyst at Science Applications International Corporation, more commonly known as SAIC, where he provided research analysis on arms control, counter WMD, and deterrence issues in the Air Force, U.S. STRATCOM, Defense Threat Reduction Agency, as well as the OSD Office of Treaty Compliance. After Justin, we're going to hear from Dr. Rebecca Gibbons. also to my right, she is a postdoctoral fellow right now with the Project on Managing the Atom at the Belfer Center at Harvard. Rebecca is also an assistant professor of international relations. She teaches courses on nuclear issues, international security, and the international order. And at Belfer, she's working on a book manuscript that I'm hopeful we'll hear more about the nuclear nonproliferation regime. Formerly, she was a predoctoral Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the RAND Corporation. And finally, to my far left, we are joined by Sara Kuches-Fahani, a senior policy analyst at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation and the senior program coordinator for the Fissile Materials Working Group, who I think we're joined by several members of today. Sara is currently writing her own book on the global nuclear order, which is set to come out later this year, and I think we'll hear about that as well. Previously, she has held research and teaching positions at the University of Georgia, Los Alamos National Laboratory, the RAND Corporation, the European Union Institute for Security Studies in Paris, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. So thank you all for agreeing to join us and offer some thoughts on Heather's work and your own. I think we will get started, and I'll ask you to limit your marks to 10 minutes.
No problem. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and my thanks to Michael and Hannah, the Stimson Center, for organizing this event and inviting me to be a part of it. So an opening caveat. The views I express today are my own, not those of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or National Defense University. I'm going to work to build off of Heather's remarks by offering some suggestions with regard to potential future approaches for confidence-building measures and strategic arms negotiations that could address the broad deficits of trust that exist both between major powers and also between NPT nuclear and non-nuclear states. Now, importantly, these proposals are intended to address both these deficits and improve the security of major powers by dialing down the risks of future brinkmanship, crisis, and conflict. So I'm going to lay out a possible way forward, advancing on two separate but potentially mutually supporting axes. First is the pursuit of new confidence-building measures on improved communication and crisis management between the NPT Nuclear 5. The second is a possible approach for great power negotiations on 21st century strategic armaments. Let's begin with the NPT Nuclear 5 and confidence-building measures. It's long overdue that the Nuclear 5, which have a special role with regard to nuclear order, not solely limit its nuclear CBMs to a handful that exist between the United States and Russia that were negotiated decades ago and within a different geopolitical context. I'd suggest that the Nuclear 5 consider a couple steps to improve their ability to communicate and coordinate during any future nuclear crisis. As they'll make negotiating a potential agreement easier, these crises need not be limited to those involving the Nuclear 5. The rationale for negotiations could and should include improving the ability to communicate and coordinate during a future crisis involving a nuclear state or states outside the NPT. The first step could be the negotiation of an agreement to establish protocol and communications links for, as close as possible, a real-time, secure 24/7 communications channel between the leaders of the Nuclear 5. Now, many of you are familiar with U.S. nuclear football, briefcase which serves as the physical embodiment of the capability for the U.S. President to promptly issue commands to the U.S. nuclear deterrent force at all times and under all circumstances. Now, the mechanics of doing so go beyond the football, but the football is both a critically important tool and a powerful symbol of the U.S. nuclear posture and command and control. And similarly, other state leaders with nuclear forces at their disposal have their own means for ensuring their full and direct command and control of their own nuclear forces at all times. So I think it would be a powerful statement with regard to the importance invested in ensuring that miscommunication does not contribute to a spiraling future nuclear crisis if all the NPT Nuclear 5 states agreed to add a second briefcase next to their respective footballs. The second briefcase would contain whatever was necessary to establish secure communications, by video if at all possible rather than just audio, with other Nuclear 5 leaders, or could contain a device akin to a specialized beacon that could send and receive special alerts or notifications telling the recipient to make tracks to a secure comms channel because there was a nuclear matter that required the immediate attention of all the Nuclear 5 heads of state. I'm not underestimating the security, logistics, and technical challenges associated with what would be the world's greatest and most secure video teleconference device. I recognize there are always means to put the president quickly in touch with individual foreign counterparts. This new device or mechanism, as with the nuclear football, is intended to be both a tool and a symbol. It sets aside a specific channel with specific use protocols intended for communicating, negotiating, resolving, and or taking collective action to address the most urgent, weighty, and existential type of crisis. Everyone's familiar with the idea that the U.S. president has a nuclear attack button. So it's worth asking, why not have a nuclear diplomacy button? And why not ensure that all NPT Nuclear 5 heads of state have nuclear diplomacy buttons as well? As a second step, I would suggest that the P5 commit to establishing a nuclear risk reduction center network. Now, the US and Russia Federation, as a result of a 1987 agreement, founded these centers, or NERCs for short, which became the conduits for official notifications on a range of nuclear and other arms control agreements, to include INF, START, New START, Open Skies, and others. Now, the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center is not a substitute for leadership hotlines, but it's a critical supplement. It's a secure comms channel that transmits agreement-mandated notifications on force levels, force movements, intent to inspect, and other matters. The setting of up to 3 additional nuclear risk reduction centers could be twinned with the negotiation of a new NPT Nuclear 5 agreement that could serve as an initial pilot effort for all 5 to share some information, not much, but some, regarding their own nuclear forces. And what might this agreement be? Well, all 5 states recognize that military exercises can lead to miscalculation. The first agreement could be modeled on the 1989 US-Russia reciprocal advance notification of major strategic exercises, which was a simple and straightforward agreement whereby the 2 sides agreed to provide advance notification of a major exercise involving long-range nuclear-capable bombers. A Nuclear 5 nuclear exercise agreement could provide for advance notification of 2 types of exercises. First, any major exercise involving nuclear forces and conventional forces exercising together. Second, any exercise expressly devoted to nuclear forces, to include both field and command post exercises. Information would not need to be onerous. The intent would be to develop a notification to be transmitted to the other 4 nuclear risk reduction centers to alert the other parties that nuclear-capable forces will be going into the air and into the sea and operating as part of an exercise that in a way that will look different than normal day-to-day peacetime operations. The idea of this difference, when properly communicated with others, is neither unusual nor cause for alarm. So those are a couple suggestions for ways the NPT Nuclear 5, building off of principles and procedures first developed by the United States and Russia during the Cold War, could develop new confidence-building mechanisms to collectively help themselves and communicate to other states that they take seriously the risk that future nuclear crises could catalyze armed conflict. They've taken steps to address this risk. Second, a possible new framework for arms control between the great powers. I'm referring here to US, Russia, and China. So I think it's important for the great powers, in order to reduce the risk that their present competition across strategic domains could cause increased friction and tension, and perhaps lead to crises and even future armed conflict. I think it's important for them to embark on negotiations that are broader than the strategic arms negotiations of the Cold War era. Strategic arms of the 21st century are not simply nuclear arms. There are other ways to achieve strategic effects. As we reach the sunset of New START, which even if extended will end in 2026, it's important to hold future talks that encompass forces beyond those covered by this treaty. In this present era of competition, it's worth remembering that there would be no New START without START, and before that SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, sought to place a ceiling on the superpowers' respective deployed strategic nuclear forces that could slow their ongoing arms competition and serve as a stabilizing mechanism that could make easier, more substantive later talks. Beyond the agreements that were eventually reached through the SALT process, the process was also invaluable for defining terms and concepts that laid the foundation for future treaties and agreements. Now, at present, talks on a range of armaments that are strategically important and have strategic effects are spread across venues, and efforts to address them are haphazard, piecemeal, and subject in some cases to outside spoilers. I think it would be worthwhile to have the US, Russia, and China hold talks, or even talks about talks, regarding a process and forum for the 3 together to address strategic weapons based on the premise that a 21st century conflict between any 2 of them would be potentially catastrophic and must be avoided. So a couple suggestions, and here I'm riffing off ideas offered by Heather and others. First, the great powers could hold talks on limitations on 21st century strategic launchers, specifically on overall numeric ceiling for these launchers, with the term defined to encompass the following. Strategic launchers would be intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, long-range bombers, hypersonic platforms, and ground-launched ballistic missiles with anti-space missions. All the above represent strategic launchers, that is, they're platforms that can carry and deliver weapons over great distances and to strategic effect. Importantly, each of the great powers have concerns about the other's strategic launchers and would have an interest in potential limitation upon them. It's true that these concerns are not evenly spread across all systems and all parties. The idea of potentially placing a ceiling upon these launchers could be compelling enough to begin negotiations. An overall ceiling would also grant each party the flexibility to determine their own force mix. As with SALT, the idea is to corral and slow competition and to lay the groundwork for more substantive future agreements that can include notifications, on-site inspections, and other elements of arms control. There's another feature that could be considered as a part of this. The list of launchers I've suggested here are all offensive systems, so what about strategic defenses? As a preamble of New START notes, there is, quote, the existence of an interrelationship between strategic offensive forces and strategic defensive arms. Though this interrelationship will become more important as strategic nuclear arms are reduced. Audience is probably well aware that the US and Russia agree on the principle of this interrelationship, but disagree on whether present practices are already impacting it. Now, Russian concerns are misplaced. The 21st century strategic arms talks could incorporate the following into an overall ceiling to address the offense-defense dynamic. Now, all states have an inherent right to self-defense, and strategic missile defenses against rogue states with limited but lethal long-range missile arsenals are not subject to prohibition. We're not going back to the ABM treaty. As arsenals are limited, the rogue arsenals, talks could consider a dynamic sublimit on strategic missile defense interceptors at a number more than enough to defend against rogues. This sublimit would only apply past a certain ceiling. Let's say for the sake of argument, the great powers have agreed to a ceiling of 1,000 for all strategic launchers and 100 for this dynamic sublimit on strategic interceptors. I say dynamic because this is not a concrete limit. You can deploy more than 100, but if you do, each interceptor above 100 also counts as strategic offensive launchers, i.e. the more defenses you deploy, the more offenses you draw down. This way you choose the strategic deterrence and defense balance you consider best. That's also a means to address concerns that any one party would attempt to build up offenses and defenses without limit that would allow it to overwhelm any kind of strategic deterrent fielded by others. So these are a couple interesting concepts that are out there, and I want to state them here because I'd emphasize we're at the ideas and concept stage. In closing, let me underline that trust is going to be very difficult to restore. Russia's violation of the INF Treaty and efforts to undermine the CWC on behalf of its Syrian ally highlight the significant challenges in attempting to advance any kind of confidence-building measure or arms control talks at present. So trust is very low, but risks are too high. So perhaps shared interest in seeking risk reduction can spur a new era of negotiation and agreement that can include, but is not limited to, the nuclear forces fielded by the contemporary great powers. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the Stimson Center for having me. It's great to be here this afternoon with friends and colleagues. So my remarks are going to follow up from Heather's discussion of the NPT. And in particular, I'm going to focus on what the U.S. could do to improve relations with the states that promoted and negotiated the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And I'm going to begin just briefly recapping some of the relatively recent history that shapes my own understanding of the ban movement. So I'm going to go back to 2000, the 2000 NPT RevCon. That's when all the parties came together and they agreed on those 13 practical steps towards disarmament. And at the time, those steps were considered stronger language on nuclear disarmament than had ever been agreed to before. Fast forward to 5 years later, it's the George W. Bush administration, and they refused to agree to again commit to those 13 steps from 2000. The conference ends without a consensus document. And so the message to those seeking disarmament after 2005 is that you can negotiate with the nuclear weapon states, but the promises that are extracted may be reneged upon later. So in the aftermath of that 2005 review conference, there's concern amongst some NPT parties, and particularly some powerful, I would argue, middle power states in Europe. They think something needs to change. They're worried about the future of the NPT if there's not further progress on nuclear disarmament. The post-2005 context is also when ICANN was founded for some of these same concerns. So then, after this, there's another period of disarmament optimism. We have that op-ed that was written by Schultz, Perry, Kissinger, and Nunn in the Wall Street Journal in 2007, calling for nuclear disarmament and calling for the US to take a real leadership role in that approach. We have, of course, President Obama's Prague speech in 2009, and then soon after we have New START negotiations. So those seeking nuclear disarmament thought that there was a real opportunity for progress here in the latter 2000s. But again, this theme, those hopes were largely dashed when the price of New START ratification in the US Senate was billions of dollars for the nuclear enterprise, and then when the Obama administration committed to what may be a $1.2 trillion modernization plan. And so again, the message here to disarmament advocates is that the nuclear weapon states plan to have these weapons for a very, very long time, generations. And so the goal of this new approach, by those who are very frustrated with this lack of progress, or what they see as a lack of progress, is the new approach is to create a global norm against the possession of nuclear weapons. So a normative prohibition against having nuclear weapons. And their hope is that if this norm spreads, it will create pressure on the nuclear weapon states to get rid of their nuclear weapons. And so, as Heather explained, there's a deep divide between the states that promoted this new treaty last summer and the nuclear weapon states, including the US. And so I'm going to give 5 ways that the US can start to help bridge this divide. Some of these steps might seem very minor, but I think with the trust deficit we have, they actually do matter. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about what I think the other side can do, and here I'm exclusively picking on the US. All right, so first, the nuclear weapon states and the US can simply acknowledge that the Humanitarian Initiative accomplished something. The 3 humanitarian conferences on the consequences of nuclear weapons that were held in 2013 and 2014 educated a new generation of diplomats from non-nuclear weapon states about the effects of nuclear weapons. Many of them had not spent a lot of time thinking about nuclear weapons before. And yet, US diplomats, US leaders, in their talking points about these conferences, they repeatedly state that the US is well aware of the devastating impact of nuclear weapons. The US knows that nuclear weapons have these effects. But just because the US knows, it does not mean the other nations know as well. Because this is such an important issue in international security, it serves the NPT community and the international diplomatic community if more of its participants are well versed in these issues. So that was one. Second, the nuclear weapon states could explicitly acknowledge that other states deserve a place at the table when it comes to discussing nuclear weapons. Now we know that the non-nuclear weapon states are not going to have the same responsibility for negotiating reductions or early verification efforts, but they do deserve to be present when it comes to discussing the role of nuclear weapons in the world. We know that non-nuclear weapon states have been affected by nuclear weapons. Japan, Australia, Kazakhstan, Algeria, Spain, the Marshall Islands. Citizens there can tell you they've been affected by nuclear weapons. Moreover, any serious long-term disarmament verification protocol is going to have to include all states if we're going to be confident that states aren't going to proliferate. So they need to be educated in this process and learn more about it. At times, US diplomats have implied that only some states understand these issues or that only some states deserve to be at the table. So in a 2016 speech, for example, one US diplomat noted that those seeking the ban treaty had never had nuclear weapons targeted at them, implying that they did not fully understand nuclear issues. It seems like a pretty pejorative comment that seems to tell other states to leave this issue alone, you just don't understand. But the Humanitarian Impact Conferences taught these states that nuclear detonations don't respect borders. Many non-nuclear weapon states could be affected by nuclear use, whether accidental or otherwise, and so they have a right to be a part of these discussions. So number 3, the nuclear weapon states, including the US, have to find a better way to credibly communicate that they do in fact intend to honor their NPT Article 6 commitment to pursue good faith negotiations towards nuclear disarmament. So for example, working actively on considering what a future treaty protocol would look like, looking and discussing advances in verification technologies. There's a lot of colleges and universities that are working on this technology. And so in my estimation, the recent US government working paper, which Heather mentioned, that was unveiled at the 2018 NPT PrepCom, the conditions-based approach to disarmament, is not necessarily, or was not necessarily, a helpful way to communicate the seriousness of purpose about disarmament. It creates a lengthy list of criteria that will have to be met before disarmament can be achieved. And to me, if I were on the other side, I would say this is a message telling non-nuclear weapon states and ban proponents that, once again, nothing else is going to happen soon. I tried to go through this morning and write all the different steps. There's at least 17, by my count, of things that would have to happen, including solving all the regional security crises in the world. That's just one step. So to me, that doesn't say we're moving forward. And so just permit me to just make an aside on the conditions-based approach. So the conditions-based approach to disarmament implies that if conditions are met, disarmament can occur. But it also implies that if conditions change, then maybe we can reintroduce nuclear weapons, right? A norms-based approach seeks to create the shared idea in the international system that nuclear weapons are not appropriate to possess or use. So I would argue that both of these angles need to be pursued, both a conditions-based approach and a norm-based approach, if eventual disarmament is going to be achieved. If there's the conditions-based approach alone, then that, I would say it's easier for conditions to change than these moral ideas to change. So both of them are going to be relevant. Okay. Number 4, the nuclear weapon states should continue and expand on efforts to share detailed information about arms control and other areas of nuclear policy with non-nuclear weapon states. When this has happened in the past, so for example, at the last few RevCons and PrepCons, US government officials have done side events on de-alerting, on verification, on New START, on the US Nuclear Posture Review. And from what I've heard, these are all generally well received, and that people like hearing from the US about its perspective and what it does. The International Partnership for Nuclear Weapons Verification is also a forum where this is happening, where non-nuclear weapon states are learning more about the challenges of verification. And so, whereas the other side might not always like what they hear in these events, it's important for improving understanding between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. In a future scenario of nuclear disarmament, all states are frankly going to have to appreciate the ins and outs of arms control verification. All right, so 5th and finally, just a quick point. In considering how to create a more constructive dialogue amongst this community, I just want to make a point about US rhetoric. My work for this summer has been going back through and looking at all the speeches and comments US officials have made, both in the last administration and this administration, about the movement behind the ban and the ban treaty. And I would say, in general, it does little to facilitate dialogue or cooperation. The language is often exaggerated, dismissive, implicitly insulting, which cuts off any opportunities, I would argue, for cooperation. And you see that the nuclear weapon states rarely show any sympathy to the frustration that propelled the movement. All right, so to conclude, the next few years are going to be critical for the nuclear nonproliferation regime. It is worth considering what may happen if the movement behind the treaty succeeds in promoting a global norm of non-possession of nuclear weapons. It's also worth considering, what if it doesn't? What if the treaty fizzles out and little disarmament progress is made? That will again cause this great frustration I've talked about disarmament progress among many non-nuclear weapon states and disarmament advocates. How will they channel their frustration next time? What options will be available to them?
Thank you, Hannah, for the invitation to be here today, to Heather for your remarks on kicking off this stellar discussion, and to Justin and Rebecca for your insights into this issue. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have been asked to discuss the future of the global nuclear order, which I'm happy to do, especially since, as Hannah mentioned, I have the book coming out precisely on this topic in November of this year. I've also been asked to offer some creative diplomatic mechanisms to address current trust deficits, all in under 10 minutes, no less. But luckily, I speak really quickly. But no, I will not speak too fast. Okay, first, the future of the global nuclear order. Well, before discussing its future, let's take a step back and ask ourselves, what exactly is the global nuclear order? We've heard the term thrown about today, we hear it in policy discussions and academic articles, but what does it actually mean? Indeed, when one thinks about nuclear weapons, the word order may not automatically spring to mind, given their disorderly, devastating, and destructive power. How then can we speak of a global nuclear order when the two latter terms are an oxymoron? In my book, I describe global nuclear order as the process by which nuclear weapons affect the world order, specifically the extent to which nuclear politics play an important role in international politics, and that what happens on the global political stage is influenced by the role of nuclear weapons. Whether we like it or not, nuclear weapons enjoy a strong political currency and as such continue to play an integral role in shaping the world order. It is important to note, however, that the global nuclear order has not always been orderly. Indeed, over the course of the near 75 years existence of nuclear weapons, the stability of the global nuclear order, similar to the world order, has ebbed and flowed, leading to a global nuclear disorder. Eisenhower's 1953 Atoms for Peace program was a prime example of how a perfectly innocent concept of sharing technology to promote the peaceful uses of atomic energy to countries throughout the world led to a global nuclear disorder conundrum many years later. While the program helped create the global nuclear industry, as well as facilitated the remarkable progress in the use of nuclear technology to improve public health and human development, and of course serve as the catalyst for the creation of the IAEA, it also contributed to heightened nuclear risks. Some of the countries that benefited from Atoms for Peace went on to create nuclear weapons programs using the knowledge and resources acquired under it. So what is the purpose of global nuclear order? For those that advocate disarmament, the purpose of global nuclear order would be the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. By this logic, world peace would ensue because it would make the use of nuclear weapons impossible. An alternative view, however, might consider the purpose of global nuclear order similar to that of the NPT's mandate, preventing the further proliferation of nuclear weapons. This view is largely supported by the nuclear weapon states since they have a strong interest in maintaining their great power status afforded to them by their nuclear weapons. A third view, offered by Nicola Horsburgh, so it's not just you, Heather, name-dropping fellow academics, I'll do it too. Nicola Horsburgh, she would favor the deterrent value of nuclear weapons and would argue that the purpose of global nuclear order is strategic. It would encourage improvement on the effectiveness of deterrence, thereby preventing the escalation of crises to the nuclear level. Arms control proponents would likely support this view, arguing that the purpose of global nuclear order is to control nuclear arms and limit nuclear capabilities. Based on this, then, it is clear that global nuclear order depends on perspective, specifically on how one views the purpose and role of nuclear weapons, especially since what can seem orderly from one perspective can equally be viewed as disorderly from another. How do we decide whether nuclear weapons are orderly or disorderly? The answer depends on perspective. The nuclear weapon states will tell us that they are orderly because of deterrence and their contribution to the stability of the international status quo, while the overwhelming number of non-nuclear weapon states will tell us that they are disorderly, not only because of the categorization of states that they created, the haves versus the have-nots, but also because of their sheer devastating and destructive power. Perspective, then, is key in understanding the global nuclear order, and reminds us that there is always at least two sides to consider before any definitive judgment can be made. Let's take the ban treaty. From the perspective of the non-nuclear weapon states, the treaty would greatly contribute to the world order since its goal would lead towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Yet from the perspective of the nuclear weapon states, it would destabilize the world order because it would rid the world of nuclear weapons, which, as the nuclear weapon states would argue, are orderly. It is really hard to definitively pick a side on the extent to which nuclear weapons contribute to global order, but it forces us to value the importance of understanding the paradigm from all perspectives and not just from one myopic viewpoint. However, undoubtedly, competing perspectives will arise. How do we decide which perspective carries more weight? Can there be a more important perspective? Does that too depend on perspective? In the same vein, who should be responsible for sustaining the global nuclear order? The nuclear weapon, nuclear armed states, the non-nuclear weapon states, or both? I would argue both. All nuclear weapon states, whether they're recognized, unrecognized, declared, undeclared, have a role to play in the maintenance and sustainability of the global nuclear order. More pointedly, though, there is also a role for the non-nuclear weapon states to further global nuclear order, especially since some of them are allies of the P5 who rely on the P5's nuclear weapons as a provision of a positive security assurance. It is clear that there is a disconnect between the less powerful and powerful states, seen through the composition of the P5, which in no way reflects the cultural diversity or strategic interests of the entire world. It is the P5, the overwhelming minority of the world states, who are enabled and legitimized by the NPT to maintain nuclear weapons denied to other states, creating a world order dominated by hypocrisy and rife with discriminatory and unfair politics. As we've heard today, the ban treaty is the first legally binding international agreement to comprehensively prohibit nuclear weapons, with the goal of leading towards their eventual total elimination. Even though none of the nuclear weapon or armed states have voted to adopt the treaty, the 122 states that did indicates that a large number of UN member states are committed to the eventual disarmament of all nuclear weapons. And it is through this mechanism that the non-nuclear weapon states may be able to contribute to the global nuclear order, and it will be interesting to monitor the increase of signatories to this treaty over the next few years. So what are our next steps? Well, for the first time since the Cold War, conversations about the role and impact of nuclear weapons on our day-to-day lives are filtering beyond the halls of government offices and onto the front pages of international newspapers and across digital airwaves via global podcasts. There is clearly an urgent need to pursue national and international policies that will reduce nuclear threats and the political currency these devastating weapons continue to enjoy in order to help create new advocates, be they in the classroom, on the streets, or in government across the world. So what can we do? Specifically, what policy options and public actions exist that may help sustain the global nuclear order and address current trust deficits? I offer 4 potential avenues that we may explore that might be helpful. First, it is important for students, policy practitioners, and the public to be informed about nuclear weapons. While nuclear weapons may seem to be outside our day-to-day lives, our comfort zones, and beyond our control, we all have a stake in avoiding death and destruction. We should want to live our lives free from the catastrophic annihilation that can be bestowed upon us by nuclear weapons. An interest in survival should therefore motivate us to learn as much as we can about the powerful and dangerous technologies that can destroy our lives. And these type of events are very, very helpful in this endeavor. Second, as all diplomats, professors, and negotiators know, dialogue matters. Let's talk to each other in the classroom, on the streets, in government, in international fora, at our workplace, with friends, colleagues, and family, here and afar, and share what we have learned. The more we talk to each other, the more we can understand and adapt to different perspectives pertaining to the global nuclear order. Research has shown that cooperation levels are substantially increased when actors engage in face-to-face communication, thereby emphasizing the value of personal contact and fostering cooperative outcomes. But dialogue involves more. It includes an openness to two-way interaction and a sense of being involved in a common enterprise directed towards problem solving. Establishing a forum for dialogue can enhance the impact of communication on the prospects for cooperation. Third, citizens in nuclear weapon states' democracies should reach out to their government representatives expressing concern about their tax dollars, pounds, euros, rupees, etc. being spent on nuclear weapons. Democracies provide a forum for citizens to exercise and engage in their democratic right to ask questions and seek answers from their government representatives on how they perceive their nuclear weapons contributing to the world order. Equally, citizens in non-nuclear weapon states' democracies should ask their government representatives what they are doing to sustain the global nuclear order. Finally, in order to sustain the global nuclear order, we need leadership, courage, and hard work to persevere. And we need it from all states, nuclear and non-nuclear. We know that nuclear threats and hostilities are on the rise. Let us remember that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was negotiated and signed at the height of the Cold War, when nuclear tensions were on the rise. Diplomacy prevailed, showing that it was instrumental in unlocking the potential for real security. The spirit of trust and cooperation needs to be restored, which rests with heads of state talking to one another, even on contentious issues such as nuclear weapons. The example of the NPT being negotiated at the height of the Cold War should inspire and motivate international governments to believe that discussions and negotiations on the existing stark nuclear realities we face today can be possible, motivating them to take action. International governments must lead, be courageous, and restart their nuclear conversations such that global nuclear order may be sustained and that trust in the nuclear realm can be restored. Thank you.
All right, thank you all very much. I think you've given us more than enough to chew on in the coming minutes. I'm going to exercise my right as moderator and ask the first question, but then what we'll do is bundle them in groups of 3. So I would ask everyone to wait until the microphone is in your hand and then go ahead and give us your name and your affiliation, and please form your question in the form of a question. So my initial question to each of you is, in the next few years, how important do you see the role of individual leaders in global nuclear policy making? So that's our first one, and then I'll take 2 more questions. Yes, ma'am. Just a second. Sorry, because we have several people
My name is
joining
Grace
us.
Kong. My question has to do with North Korea. How would you advise the Trump administration on dealing with North Korea? How does this fit within the frameworks you've discussed today?
Great, thank you. We'll take one more question. Yes, ma'am. Right there, Nikhil.
Yes, Secretary Pompeo told Senate hearing last week that North Korea is producing fissile materials. So how can we see this in the frame of trust building? How can the United States deal with North Korea that keeps on reneging agreements with the United States? How can we have a successful dialogue with North Korea? Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, that's enough to chew on, I think, initially. If you raise your hand while they're responding, I'll go ahead and jot down a note to come to you next. Who wants to go first?
All right. I'm going to totally punt on the North Korea issues because I'm not a North Korea expert, and it's such a sensitive topic. I don't want to completely bungle the words. All I would say is the global nuclear regime is weaker without having a denuclearized North Korea in it. And I think within the NPT would be very well served to focus more on the North Korea issue, perhaps rather than other initiatives. Going into details, I'm honestly not going to go there. I'm going to defer to any other expert. On the role of individual leaders. All right, we'll call out the elephant in the room. Yes, Trump is a challenge in terms of America's credibility and a lot of the trust issues that I talked about today. But I also think that a lot of the trust challenges, at least that I talked about, predate the Trump administration. And so I know that that wasn't the direction your question was necessarily going in, but I did feel a need to just kind of get that ball rolling. I think that one of the bigger challenges that the U.S. particularly is going to face, it's not so much an issue of individual leaders, it's about changes in administration. And so if you're a U.S. partner, whether that be Russia, a European ally, or a ban treaty supporter, and if you get some sort of agreement out of the current administration, what credibility does it have that that's going to carry over to another one? And that's where I think individual leaders matter, but I think consistency both in messaging and policy across administrations or even within one administration is equally important. And then I would just add, this was an interesting observation I had from my research that I didn't expect to come up. And this was about U.S. engagement with supporters of the nuclear ban treaty, and particularly with allies around the ban treaty. And what you saw was obviously change of administration. A lot of people left the State Department, but some people stayed. And this isn't senior government level. This is mid-level, working level. Those people who stayed carried on the work of the previous administration, and quite a few allies actually observed that and said, it was really encouraging that there was consistency in who we kept interacting with. And so I think that the role of personalities is important, and we give a lot of attention to personalities at the highest levels of government, but I think personalities and personal relationships, even at lower levels of government, can also be equally, if not more important.
Thank you.
I'll take a whack. With regard to individual leaders, I think I would note it is extremely important, and when you think about it, if a leader of a major state is going to take on board nuclear diplomacy as something that they want to do as part of their policy agenda, but frankly, part of the legacy that they're going to leave afterward, you need to, up front, acknowledge that you are taking a substantial risk with regard to limited political capital. That's international political capital, diplomatic capital with other states, not just potential adversaries, but any allies that might be involved. You to marshal allies behind whatever proposal you're going to put forward. You're going to need to engage in bare knuckle negotiations, probably with potentially competing states. At the same time that you're probably spending domestic political capital, especially for the democracies. Any agreement has to make it through the legislative branch. So you are taking on board a significant investment of time and capital. And that can be daunting for, I think, any individual leader to take on when the world presents so many challenges and demands on their time and their capital. So I would note that it is a challenge, but in the absence of individual leadership, I think the historic record shows that not a lot happens. You need a leader, or preferably more than one leader, to push forward negotiations, push forward new ideas, and really be willing to carry it through. That's hard to do. With regard to North Korea, I would note, trust is the central theme of this event. The less trust there is, the more intensive verification must be. With regard to moves in the past that North Korea has taken that were intended to advance towards some sort of concept of disarmament, we've seen that they've been quite reversible. So that's why the idea of irreversible has been put forward in the CVID formulation. The other is that I think Heather noted, trust, the levels can differ. If you were part of a compact with like-minded states that you have robust relationships with, maybe the level of trust and verification is different. Obviously, that's not the case with North Korea. Therefore, the level of verification up front needs to be broader and deeper, probably even so, even further than we see in agreements like START and New START and INF, which to date are sort of the gold standard when it comes to bilateral nuclear arms compacts, or something like the IAEA, but AP on steroids, I would guess, if you're talking about some other type of agreement.
Thanks. You good?
Well, if I could just add to the role of the individual leader, yes, it's important in the sense that, prior to President Trump, we had a very charismatic president here in the US who decided to make nuclear security one of his kind of main issues. And, the nuclear security summit process, and I don't just say that because we did a release of a report that we wrote 2 weeks ago, but it's important because the nuclear security summit process was very much the first time that we saw the issue of nuclear security and nuclear weapons kind of being brought to the forefront of the international political leadership kind of agenda. So I do think, obviously, the role of the individual leader is important, but it's not just at the leadership level, it's also at the lower levels too. So I just wanted to add to that.
Great. Thank you all. Other questions? Yes, sir, please. Right here, Nikhil. And others?
So my question is for Dr. Williams, and this was really just a clarification question.
May I ask you to identify yourself?
Sure. Will Satron Institute for China America Studies.
Thank you.
So I understand the perspective that non-nuclear weapon states are frustrated with the nuclear weapon states and see them not acting in good faith towards their NPT obligations. But you said that also kind of went the other way around, that nuclear weapon states felt betrayed and that they didn't see non-nuclear weapon states acting in good faith. And I was just hoping you could elaborate on that point a little bit. Thanks.
Great. Yes, ma'am. Nikhil, can I have you come up front? Thank you. And then I think I saw a hand in the back.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your valuable insights. And my name is Valeria Lozova. I'm Carnegie Endowment for International Peace intern. And first off, I have a question for Dr. Williams. Could you please dwell a little bit more on the topic of the U.S. And Sweden and Netherlands cooperation? And the second question is to the whole panel. What are your thoughts on the nuclear order in the future in general? Should it be status quo as we have it now, but with all those proposed areas of cooperation that you offered? Should we shoot for absolutely non-nuclear world, or, you know, after the ban treaty was boycotted by nuclear states, a lot of experts and general activists started talking about Walton argument that the more the better. So what is your perspective?
Great, thank you. I think we'll roll with those two for now.
So, Will?
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a really great question. So first should tease out not all non-nuclear weapon states share the same position. Obviously, on the ban treaty, you have the NATO non-nuclear weapon states, none of which joined the ban treaty. NATO issued a really strong statement when the ban treaty was concluded, saying that they would not join. You do have the group of kind of the core group of states, so Mexico, Austria, Ireland, New Zealand, really pushed for middle ground states, states in the zones. So that's an important distinction. I think one of the biggest sources of distrust and there's some people here who were in government at the time, so they can clarify afterwards if I'm wrong here. But one source of distrust from the U.S. perspective was that during the humanitarian impacts conferences, the impression was given that this was not about a ban treaty. And I recently published on this, so I can talk about it. It's in the Non-Proliferation Review, if anyone wants to read it. It was specifically the Mexico conference. In the lead up to the NIRE conference, which was February of 2014, the United States engaged with the Mexican government, so no nuclear weapon state went to the Oslo conference. And the U.S. was exploring whether or not to get involved in the humanitarian conferences. And there were meetings held between some U.S. government officials and some Mexican government officials, and there was a discussion about if the U.S. went, what would be the agenda. And some sort of an understanding was agreed to, and the Mexicans changed the agenda. And changed, the U.S. thought that Mexico would have been a bit more cooperative towards their position and would have been more encouraging for the U.S. to be involved. And then, from one perspective, they reneged on it. And this was taken as a sign of, you aren't actually interested in having the nuclear weapon states there. You aren't actually interested in working with us. So, where there's a question or a comment earlier, the nuclear weapon states boycotted the ban treaty. Well, the ban treaty community didn't really do anything to try to get them involved. They didn't reach out. They didn't build they didn't kind of build an atmosphere that was conducive to the position of the nuclear weapon states. And so I think that is the real, a deep source of distrust on the U.S. side, which is, you told us this was about one thing, and you clearly did the opposite. I would offer one kind of, balancing point to this, which was, I went to 3 all-humanitarian impacts conferences. The Oslo conference, the first one, that one really was not about ban treaty. I didn't hear a ban treaty ever come up in all the discussions that I had there. It was about talking about nuclear weapons in a different way. I found it extremely compelling and refreshing. At the end of the NIRE conference, that narrative changed. But that's where, again, where I think I can see the U.S. government perspective on this one, which is, by the time the U.S. was getting involved in those discussions, clearly the horse left the barn. And then if I can just quickly to Valeria, comments. Right, so U.S., Sweden, Netherlands. Sweden is a really important NATO partner and middle ground state. Sweden participated in the ban treaty negotiations. Netherlands also participated but voted against it. So these are states that have been involved in the ban movement, but Netherlands probably not going to join. Sweden, we're waiting to see the results of the national study. So those are 2 countries that are in really interesting positions because they have strong domestic anti-nuclear public sentiment. So they're probably not going to join the ban treaty, but they need to show that they're doing something to speak to their public audiences, to have some legitimacy. And so ideas for cooperation that I hear coming up are, I threw out a few before, but I went through them quickly. So specific risk reduction measures. But this is risk reduction in terms of crisis communication, confidence building measures. I'm not talking about de-alerting. That's a bridge too far. I think a lot of European countries want to continue the conversation about humanitarian consequences, and I actually think it's a little bit tragic that the discussion about humanitarian consequences ended with the ban treaty. those were really inspiring and interesting conferences, and a lot of important data was raised. You heard human stories, and the ban treaty kind of overtook that initiative. I think it would be great if we can return to those discussions in some form. I think I'll stop there. I talked too much. Sorry.
That's really good.
Yes, a couple points, and also to build off what Heather said, and going on the question of the future of the nuclear order. I think a lot hinges on U.S. leadership and political will, and the U.S. being able to bring countries together. The U.S. has been very heavy-handed at times. So if we take the example of Sweden, the fact that the letter that Secretary Mattis sent to the Swedish government, basically saying, if you join this treaty, you can say goodbye to any cooperation we might have if you're ever attacked. And that letter was, I don't know if the exact text of the letter was publicized, but it was in the open media that the U.S. had sent this letter, right? And so I wonder in the long term, if the U.S. relies, and we see this with the Trump administration and the recent WHO thing about breastfeeding, the fact that they take such a heavy-handed approach and a coercive approach, I don't think that's going to be successful in the long term. Another idea to piggyback on what Heather was saying is I think one area where we can have cooperation and the Europeans can get more involved is looking at victims' assistance. One of the articles in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons talks about compensating victims and looking at victims' assistance. That's a place where the U.S. has done the most to compensate victims of any country that have tested nuclear weapons. So that could be an area to talk about best practices. I can see why there might be resistance to that, but I think that is a potential area of cooperation. I also think, going back to some of the inspiring things, both the victim testimonials and just the facts that were presented about nuclear weapons and the effects of nuclear weapons, it is worth coming together as an international community and talking more about those facts. There are academic papers that are now contesting some of those facts that were brought up. And so I think we could get lost in debating those without, and kind of, it would be easy for both sides to say the other side is wrong when we could come together and say, well, what do we really know about the effects of nuclear weapons? And there's even new research since those conferences on a topic, for example, epigenetics, which shows that genetic markers of trauma can be passed on from one generation to another. I don't think that was part of the conference, but there's more facts that we have to talk about the effects of nuclear weapons. So I think it's a really good idea to try to revisit that separately from the ban movement. And I'll stop.
Great, thank you. Heather, do you want to jump in, or should we? All right, I think we're a little short on time, so unless anyone has a burning question. Deborah, is it a quick one? Yes. All right, you are our final question. Deborah Decker.
I'm with the Stimson Center. So I realize the United States, we change our president for, often in their policy swing. People would rather engage with Russia and China, where there's some more stability, at least in policy, some countries. And we've had in the past on the congressional side, like, Nunn and Lugar. I mean, they got together across the aisle, and then Obama and Lugar went on many trips together, and so they came together. But I'm wondering who are the leaders now who could potentially get together in Congress to help us maybe have more stability in our policies going forward? Any hope?
I have hope. I'm only going to speak to the one senator that I know a little bit about, and that's just because she's my senator, is Kirsten Gillibrand, who I think isn't interested in engaging on these issues. I think, again, Alex and others are working really hard on raising awareness for nuclear issues and educating the Hill. But if you look at the CTBT debate in 1999, I think less than a third of the senators who were there for that debate are still in post. It might be even less than a third. I think it's less than a third at this point. And so I think the issue, yes, partisanship is a serious challenge, but the other is actually education and raising awareness and understanding. Because let's be honest, nuclear issues, we get pretty wonky. We use a lot of acronyms and terms that aren't really in the daily vernacular. And so I think, and I kind of highlighted this in my opening remarks, is we have this need to just educate our own legislatures, but also perhaps educating and engaging with the public. This is something that Europe in particular, I think, really needs to do, but I mean, that's a political third rail, and I'm not sure how you do it. But I am hopeful, if anything, because some of the policies and tweets of this administration have clearly inspired people to engage more with the nuclear issue. Yeah. So maybe this should be seen as more of an opportunity and not just a challenge.
Yeah.
I'm trying to end on an optimistic note.
It was good. That's
Really
good.
trying.
It was a good optimistic note. Let me formally end us by saying thank you to all of you for joining us. I certainly learned a lot. Hope that you did. Thank you to those of you who joined us on the live stream. Thank you to our team at the Stimson Center that puts on such excellent events. And look for announcements for the next event in this series on the nuclear future and where we can go from here, with probably convening by Michael Crapon, our co-founder, who we need in the room next time. Thank you.